The ground beneath Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen's boots trembled violently as another aftershock rippled through the devastated city of Gaziantep, Turkey. Dust clouds billowed from collapsed apartment buildings, and the acrid smell of concrete dust mixed with smoke filled his nostrils. It had been 18 hours since the massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake had torn through southern Turkey and northern Syria, leaving thousands trapped beneath tons of rubble. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his dirt-stained glove. His unit, part of the U.S. Army's disaster relief team, had been deployed within hours of the catastrophe. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything he had witnessed in his 12 years of military service. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to mountains of concrete and twisted metal. The cries for help that had echoed through the night were becoming fewer and more desperate with each passing hour. "Chen, we need you over here," called out Lieutenant Rodriguez, his voice cutting through the distant sound of rescue machinery. Marcus jogged across the debris-strewn street, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass and chunks of concrete. The lieutenant was standing beside what used to be a 5-story residential building, now reduced to a pancaked pile of rubble no more than 10 feet high. "Local rescue teams think they heard something from this section," Rodriguez explained, pointing to a gap between two massive concrete slabs. "Could be survivors, but the space is too narrow for our equipment. We need someone small enough to squeeze through and assess the situation." Marcus nodded grimly. At 5'7" and lean from years of military training, he had often been chosen for tight space rescues. He had crawled through collapsed tunnels in Afghanistan and navigated bombed-out buildings in Iraq. But each situation brought its own unique dangers. The threat of secondary collapse was always present, especially with the frequent aftershocks still rattling the region. As he prepared his gear, Marcus couldn't help but think about his own family back in Sacramento. His wife Sarah and their 8-year-old daughter Emma were probably watching the news coverage, worried sick about his safety. He had managed to send a brief text message earlier that morning, letting them know he was alive and working. But communication remained spotty in the disaster zone. "I'm going in," Marcus announced, adjusting his helmet-mounted flashlight and checking his radio one final time. The opening between the concrete slabs was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to remove his tactical vest to fit through. The space beyond was pitch black, and his light beam revealed a maze of twisted rebar and broken furniture. The air inside was thick and stifling, heavy with concrete dust that made breathing difficult despite his face mask. Every few minutes, small chunks of debris would rain down from above as another aftershock reminded him how precarious his position was. He moved carefully, testing each surface before putting his full weight on it, calling out in both English and the few Turkish phrases he had learned from local interpreters. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? Merhaba?" His voice echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off broken walls and scattered debris. For several minutes, there was only silence except for the distant sound of rescue operations above ground. Then he heard it, a faint whimpering sound coming from somewhere deeper in the rubble. It wasn't human, but it was definitely alive. Marcus paused, straining his ears to locate the source. The sound came again, weak but persistent like an animal in distress. Following the sound, Marcus squeezed through an even narrower passage, his uniform tearing on jagged pieces of metal. The whimpering grew louder, and suddenly his flashlight beam illuminated a pair of dark, frightened eyes reflecting back at him. It was a dog, a medium-sized mixed breed with golden-brown fur now matted with dust and debris. The animal was trapped beneath a fallen cabinet, its hind legs pinned but apparently not broken. Around the dog, Marcus could see the remnants of what had once been someone's living room. Family photos scattered across the floor, children's toys crushed under fallen beams, and the twisted remains of a television set. "Hey there, Fuddy," Marcus said softly, extending his hand slowly toward the frightened animal. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and Marcus could see the hope flickering in its eyes. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay?" The cabinet wasn't too heavy, but it was wedged at an awkward angle that made it difficult to lift. Marcus had to brace himself against a concrete pillar and use his legs to push, while simultaneously pulling the dog free. The animal yelped once as it was freed, but immediately began licking Marcus's gloved hands in gratitude. As Marcus examined the dog for injuries, he noticed a collar with a name tag that read "Kahve," the Turkish word for coffee. The dog appeared to be unharmed except for some scrapes and severe dehydration. Marcus shared some water from his canteen, and the dog drank eagerly, its pink tongue lapping up every precious drop. "All right, Cave, let's get you out of here," Marcus said, scooping the dog into his arms. The return journey through the narrow passages was more challenging with the added weight, but the dog seemed to understand that Marcus was helping and remained calm throughout the difficult extraction. When Marcus finally emerged from the rubble with the dog in his arms, a small crowd of rescue workers and local residents had gathered. Many of the Turkish civilians began talking excitedly, and one elderly man approached with tears in his eyes. "Kava," the man said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Bu benim komşumun köpeği." Through the interpreter, Marcus learned that the dog belonged to the man's neighbor, a family of 4 who were still missing. The building had housed 12 families, and so far only 3 survivors had been pulled from the wreckage. As Marcus handed the dog over to the grateful neighbor, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Saving Kavi was a small victory in the face of such massive destruction and loss of human life, but as he looked into the dog's intelligent eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this rescue was just the beginning of something much more significant. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the disaster zone, casting long shadows across the rubble-strewn landscape. Emergency floodlights were being set up for the night shift of rescue operations. Marcus knew that the critical 72-hour window for finding survivors was already halfway closed, and time was running out for those still trapped beneath the debris. Little did he know that his decision to save one frightened dog from the ruins would soon set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever, challenging everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and what it truly means to come home from war. 3 days had passed since Marcus pulled Kavi from the rubble, and the dog had become an unofficial mascot of the American rescue team. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Kavi seemed to have appointed himself as Marcus's shadow, following the soldier everywhere and sleeping, curled up beside his cot in the temporary barracks they had established in a damaged school building. The old man who had initially claimed to know the dog's owners had disappeared shortly after the rescue, and no one else had come forward to claim Kave. The interpreter explained that many residents had fled the area, staying with relatives in other cities or in temporary refugee camps set up by the Turkish government. It was entirely possible that Kave's family was safe somewhere else, but with no way to contact them, the dog remained in limbo. "That dog's got some kind of radar for trouble," joked Corporal Williams as he watched Kave alerting the team to a small gas leak that the soldiers had missed. "Yesterday he started barking and wouldn't stop until we checked that collapsed pharmacy. Turned out there were dangerous chemical fumes building up inside." Marcus had noticed it too. Kave seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense danger before the humans did. During aftershocks, the dog would begin whining and pacing several minutes before the tremors hit, giving the rescue teams valuable warning time to evacuate unstable structures. Local rescue workers had started watching Kave's behavior as an early warning system, but it wasn't just the dog's apparent sixth sense that impressed Marcus. Kave had also shown remarkable intuition about human emotions. When they had pulled an injured elderly woman from a collapsed bakery, the dog had gently approached her and laid his head on her chest, somehow sensing that she needed comfort more than medical attention. The woman had stopped crying for the first time since her rescue, and had whispered prayers in Turkish while stroking Kave's dusty fur. "Chen, we need to talk," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, approaching Marcus as he shared his morning rations with the dog. The lieutenant's expression was serious, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with anticipation of bad news. "What's the situation, sir?" "We're getting orders to pull out tomorrow morning. The Turkish government is taking over primary rescue operations, and our job here is officially done." Rodriguez paused, glancing down at Kave, who was wagging his tail hopefully at the prospect of more food. "The question is, what are we going to do about your 4-legged friend there?" Marcus had been dreading this moment. Over the past few days, he had tried not to think about what would happen when it was time to leave Turkey. The bond he had formed with Kava felt stronger than any connection he had ever made with an animal. It wasn't just gratitude for saving the dog's life. There was something deeper, a mutual understanding that seemed to transcend the language barrier between species. "I've been thinking about that, sir. Is there any way we could arrange for Kave to be transported to the States? Maybe through one of those military animal rescue organizations?" Rodriguez shook his head sympathetically. "I already looked into it, Chen. The paperwork alone would take months, and that's assuming we could prove that no one in Turkey has a legal claim to the dog. The military doesn't have resources allocated for this kind of thing, especially not with everything else going on right now. Marcus felt his heart sink, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders and accept difficult situations without complaint. But the thought of leaving Kavi behind felt like abandoning a fellow soldier in enemy territory. "I understand, sir. I'll make sure he's taken care of before we leave." "Actually, there might be another option," Rodriguez said quietly, looking around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Off the record, some of the guys have been talking. Corporal Martinez has a contact in Istanbul who runs an animal shelter. She might be able to take Kavi temporarily while we work on getting him proper documentation for transport to the States." Marcus's eyes lit up with hope. "You mean there's still a chance?" "I'm not making any promises, Chen. But Martinez seems to think this woman might be willing to help, especially if we can contribute some money toward Kave's care. The thing is, it would all have to be unofficial. The army can't be involved in any way." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as the rescue team prepared for departure. They dismantled their equipment, filed final reports, and said goodbye to the Turkish rescue workers who had become their colleagues over the past week. But Marcus's mind was focused entirely on the possibility of saving Kaveh from an uncertain fate on the streets of a devastated city. That evening, Corporal Martinez approached Marcus with news about her contact in Istanbul. "Her name is Elif Demir, and she runs a small rescue operation out of her home. I explained the situation, and she's willing to take Kaveh, but she needs to meet him first to make sure he'll get along with her other dogs." "How far is Istanbul from here?" Marcus asked. "About 8 hours by car, but here's the thing. We'd have to transport him there tonight before the official departure tomorrow morning, and it would have to be completely off the books." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'm in. What do we need to do?" Martinez had managed to borrow a truck from one of the local aid organizations, and 3 soldiers volunteered to make the nighttime drive to Istanbul. They told their commanding officers they were making a final supply run to deliver unused medical equipment to a hospital in the region, which wasn't entirely untrue, since they did have supplies to donate. The drive through the Turkish countryside was surreal. In the darkness, it was easy to forget about the devastation they were leaving behind. Kav rode in the passenger seat next to Marcus, his head out the window, ears flapping in the cool night air. For the first time in days, the dog seemed relaxed and happy, as if he sensed that something good was about to happen. Elif Demir's house was located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Istanbul, surrounded by a high fence that enclosed a yard full of dogs of all shapes and sizes. When she opened the gate to greet them, Marcus was struck by her immediate warmth and the obvious love she had for animals. Despite the language barrier, her intentions were clear. She wanted to help. "He's beautiful," she said in accented English as Kavi approached her cautiously. Within minutes, the dog was wagging his tail and allowing her to pet him. Her other dogs sniffed around Kavi curiously, but showed no signs of aggression. "I can keep him safe," Elif promised Marcus as they watched Kavi explore his new temporary home. "I have contacts with animal rescue groups in America. We will find a way to bring him to you, I promise." As the sun began to rise over Istanbul, Marcus knelt down beside Kaveh one last time. The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had first caught his attention in the rubble, and Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'll see you again, buddy," he whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I don't know how or when, but I promise I'll find a way to bring you home." Kaveh licked his hand once, as if sealing the promise, then trotted back toward Elif's house where a bowl of fresh food was waiting. As the truck pulled away from the curb, Marcus watched through the rear window until the house disappeared from view, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his military career, or the most important decision of his life. Back at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Marcus found it impossible to settle into his normal routine. The familiar rhythms of base life, morning formations, training exercises, paperwork, felt hollow and meaningless after what he had experienced in Turkey. Every night he lay awake in his barracks room, staring at the ceiling and wondering what had happened to Kaveh. Sarah noticed the change immediately when he came home for his first weekend leave. "You're different," she said as they sat on the back porch of their modest 2-bedroom house watching Emma play in the yard. It's not just the usual post-deployment adjustment. Something happened over there that you're not telling me about. Marcus had always been able to share everything with his wife, but somehow he found it difficult to explain his connection to a dog he had known for less than a week. How could he make her understand that saving Kava had felt more meaningful than many of his officially recognized military accomplishments? "I rescued a dog from the earthquake rubble," he finally said, the words coming out in a rush. "And I had to leave him behind in Turkey. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't stop thinking about him." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. She had grown up on a farm in Iowa and had always been more attuned to animals than most people. "Tell me about him," she said simply. As Marcus described his time with Kava, he could see his wife's eyes filling with tears. When he finished explaining about Elif Demir and the promise he had made, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "We have to bring him here," she said finally. "Sarah, I don't even know if he's still alive. The rescue organization in Turkey hasn't responded to any of my emails, and I'm starting to think maybe I was naive to believe it would work out. Then we need to find out for sure. Emma's been asking for a dog for 2 years now, and maybe this is meant to be." That night, Sarah helped Marcus compose a more formal email to Elif Demir, explaining their situation and asking for an update on Kava's condition. They also began researching the requirements for importing a rescued animal from Turkey, discovering that the process was even more complicated and expensive than they had imagined. The veterinary requirements alone would cost nearly $3,000. Money they didn't have in their tight military budget. There were quarantine periods, multiple vaccinations, health certificates that had to be completed by certified veterinarians, and international transport arrangements that seemed overwhelming for a staff sergeant's salary. "Maybe we could start a fundraiser," Sarah suggested. Social media campaigns for military animal rescues have been successful before. Marcus was hesitant about making their personal situation public, but his desperation to help Kava eventually overcame his reservations. Sarah created a Facebook page called Bring Kava Home and began sharing the story of the earthquake rescue with friends and family. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the page had been shared hundreds of times, and small donations began trickling in from people touched by the story. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly Marcus found himself doing interviews about his experience in Turkey. "Staff Sergeant Chen represents the best of our military values," said the reporter from News Channel 5. "His commitment to saving this animal shows the same dedication to protecting the innocent that our soldiers demonstrate every day around the world." But the media attention also brought unexpected complications. Military regulations prohibited soldiers from using their service record for personal gain, and Marcus's commanding officer called him into the office to discuss the situation. "Chen, I understand your motivation here, and personally, I think what you're doing is admirable," said Colonel Harrison, "but you need to be very careful about how you present this story. The Army can't be seen as officially endorsing or supporting individual animal rescue efforts, especially when there are still human refugees from that earthquake who need assistance." "I understand, sir. I never intended for this to become so public. The problem is it's already out there. My advice is to keep your interviews focused on the animal welfare aspect and away from your military service. And whatever you do, don't let this interfere with your duties here on base." Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Istanbul, Elif Demir was dealing with her own challenges. Kaveh had adapted well to life at her rescue facility, but the dog's behavior had become increasingly anxious and withdrawn as the weeks passed. He spent most of his time lying by the front gate, as if waiting for someone to return. "He knows you are not here," Elif wrote in her broken English email response to Marcus. "Other dogs, they forget their old life after a few weeks. But Kaveh is different. He remembers you and he is sad." The email included several photos that made Marcus's heart ache. In the pictures, Kaveh looked healthy and well-fed, but his eyes had lost the spark of hope that Marcus remembered from their time together in the disaster zone. The dog appeared to be going through the motions of living, without really engaging with his surroundings. "I am worried about him," Elif continued. "He needs to come to you soon, or I think he will give up hope. I have contact with Animal Transport Company in Istanbul, but they need all papers ready and payment before they can make arrangements. The fundraising campaign had raised about half of the money they needed, but progress had slowed as the initial wave of media attention died down. Marcus began working extra shifts at the base maintenance facility, and Sarah took a part-time job at a local veterinary clinic to help cover the costs. 8-year-old Emma, who had initially been excited about the prospect of getting a dog, began to understand that the situation was more complicated than she had imagined. "Daddy, why can't Kaveh just get on an airplane and come home like you did?" she asked one evening at dinner. Marcus struggled to explain the bureaucratic complexities to his daughter without discouraging her enthusiasm. "Sometimes when animals travel between countries, there are special rules to make sure they stay healthy and don't get sick. We have to follow all the rules to keep Kaveh safe. But he's already sick, isn't he? Sick in his heart because he misses you?" The simple wisdom of his daughter's observation hit Marcus harder than any military briefing ever had. Kaveh wasn't just waiting to be rescued from a practical standpoint. He was emotionally suffering, and every day of delay made the situation worse. That night, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He called his father in Sacramento, a man he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years following a bitter argument about Marcus's military career choices. "Dad, I need help," he said simply when his father answered the phone. "Marcus, son, is everything all right?" For the first time in his adult life, Marcus swallowed his pride and asked his father for financial assistance. He explained the entire situation, from the earthquake rescue to the current fundraising efforts, expecting to be met with criticism or lectures about fiscal responsibility. Instead, his father was quiet for a long moment before responding. "How much do you need?" "About $1,500 to cover the remaining costs. I know it's a lot of money and I'll pay you back as soon as I can." "You don't need to pay me back, son. But I want you to promise me something. When that dog gets to Kentucky, you bring him to California to meet his grandfather. I want to see the animal that finally taught my stubborn son how to ask for help when he needs it." As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that had nothing to do with the financial burden. For the first time since leaving Turkey, he allowed himself to believe that Kaveh might actually make it home. The morning Marcus received the call that Kaveh was finally cleared for transport to the United States should have been the happiest day in months. Instead, it brought devastating news that would test his resolve in ways he never imagined. "Mr. Chen, I am so sorry to tell you this." Elif's voice crackled through the international phone connection. 3 days ago, Kaveh became very sick. The veterinarian thinks it might be something he ate, but we are not sure. He is at the animal hospital now, but his condition is not good. Marcus felt the world spin around him as he processed the words. After 3 months of fundraising, paperwork, and careful planning, Kaveh was supposed to board a flight to New York in just 2 weeks. All the health certificates were complete, the transport carrier was booked, and Emma had spent the weekend preparing a welcome home banner for the dog she had never met, but already loved. "How sick is he exactly?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. "The doctor says his kidneys are not working properly. It could be poison. Or maybe he was already sick from the earthquake trauma and it just now showing symptoms. They are doing everything they can, but—" Elif's voice trailed off, leaving the terrible possibilities unspoken. Marcus called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day making frantic international phone calls, trying to understand Kaveh's medical situation and explore treatment options. The language barrier made everything more difficult, and he found himself relying on Google Translate to communicate with Turkish veterinarians who were treating his dog thousands of miles away. Sarah found him that evening sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by printed emails and veterinary documents he couldn't fully understand. "The treatment is going to cost another $2,000, he said without looking up. "And there's no guarantee it will work. The kidney damage might be permanent. We'll find the money somehow," Sarah said firmly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Sarah, we've already spent almost $4,000, and most of that came from other people's donations and my father. How can I ask for more money when Kaveh might not even survive the treatment?" Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her pajamas and clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "Is Kaveh going to die, Daddy?" Marcus pulled his daughter onto his lap, struggling to find words that would be honest but not crushingly hopeful. "Kaveh's very sick, sweetheart. The doctors in Turkey are trying their best to help him get better. But sometimes even when doctors try their hardest, animals don't get well. but you saved him from the earthquake. You can't let him die now." The simple faith in his daughter's voice nearly broke Marcus's composure. Emma's understanding of the situation was heartbreakingly clear. In her mind, her father was a hero who rescued animals from disasters, and heroes didn't let their rescued animals die from treatable illnesses. That night, Sarah updated the Bring Kava Home Facebook page with news of the dog's illness and the additional medical costs. The response was swift and emotional. People who had followed the story for months expressed their heartbreak and immediately began sharing the post to raise awareness about Kava's critical condition. Among the dozens of supportive comments, one stood out. It was from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a veterinarian in Nashville who had been following Kava's story since the beginning. "I've been in contact with colleagues in Istanbul, and I'd like to offer my services pro bono if Kava makes it to the States. I specialize in kidney disease in dogs, and there are treatment options available here that might not be accessible in Turkey. Don't give up hope yet." The offer provided a glimmer of light in an increasingly dark situation, but it still depended on Kava surviving the next few days and being healthy enough for international transport. Marcus threw himself into researching canine kidney disease, learning everything he could about treatment options and recovery rates. He discovered that dogs could live relatively normal lives with reduced kidney function if the disease was caught early enough and properly managed. The key was getting through the acute phase of the illness and stabilizing the dog's condition. On the 4th day of Kava's hospitalization, Elif called with cautiously optimistic news. "The doctor says his numbers are a little bit better today. Still not good, but better than yesterday. He is eating small amount of food and drinking water on his own." Marcus felt his first moment of genuine hope in days. Does the vet think he'll be strong enough to travel in a few weeks? Maybe if he continues to improve. But Mr. Chen, I must tell you something else. The dog, he is different now. Very quiet, very sad. Even when he was waiting for you before, he still played sometimes with other dogs. Now he just lies in the corner and stares at nothing. The description reminded Marcus of soldiers he had known, who had suffered from severe depression after traumatic experiences. It seemed that Kaveh was experiencing his own version of emotional trauma, compounded by physical illness and prolonged separation from the person he had bonded with during the earthquake rescue. "I need to come to Turkey," Marcus announced to Sarah that evening. "I can't leave him there alone while he's fighting for his life." "Marcus, you can't just take leave to fly to Turkey for a dog. The army won't approve that kind of request. Then I'll take personal leave. Use my vacation days. I have 2 weeks saved up." Sarah looked at her husband with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That's going to cost thousands of dollars we don't have, and there's no guarantee it will help Kava's recovery." "I know it sounds crazy, but I think he needs to know I didn't abandon him. Maybe if he sees me again, it will give him the will to fight through this illness." The idea was impractical and financially reckless, but Sarah could see the determination in Marcus's eyes that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. When Marcus Chen made a promise, he kept it regardless of the personal cost. "Let me call your father," she said. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right." Marcus's father not only agreed to help fund the emergency trip to Turkey, but he also offered to fly out to Kentucky to stay with Sarah and Emma while Marcus was gone. "That dog must be something special to inspire this kind of loyalty," he said. "I'm proud of you, son. Not many people would go to these lengths to keep a promise to an animal." Within 48 hours, Marcus had arranged emergency leave, booked flights to Istanbul, and coordinated with Elif to visit Kaveh at the veterinary hospital. The night before his departure, he sat on Emma's bed, reading her a story about a loyal dog who traveled across the country to find his way home. "Do you think Kaveh will remember you, Daddy?" Emma asked as he tucked her in. "I hope so, sweetheart. But even if he doesn't remember me, I'll remember him. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is show up for someone when they need us most, even if they can't tell us they're grateful." As Marcus's plane lifted off from Nashville International Airport, he pressed his face to the window and watched the lights of Tennessee disappear below. He was flying toward an uncertain reunion with a dog who might not survive his illness, spending money his family couldn't afford, and taking risks with his military career that could have lasting consequences. But for the first time since leaving Turkey 4 months earlier, Marcus felt like he was finally doing the right thing. Whatever happened next, he would be able to look Kaveh in the eyes and know that he had kept his promise to never abandon him. The veterinary hospital in Istanbul was nothing like the modern facilities Marcus was accustomed to seeing in the United States. Located in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, it served as both an emergency clinic and a sanctuary for street animals that had nowhere else to go. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the sounds of barking dogs and meowing cats created a chaotic symphony that somehow felt oddly comforting. Dr. Mehmet Özkan, the veterinarian treating Kaveh, greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and concerned eyes. His English was better than Marcus had expected, and he wasted no time in explaining the dog's condition. Your Kaveh is a fighter, but his body has been through too much trauma, Dr. Özkan explained as they walked through the crowded facility. First the earthquake, then the stress of separation, and now this kidney crisis. His spirit is as damaged as his organs. They stopped outside a large kennel where a familiar golden-brown shape lay motionless on a blanket. Kaveh looked smaller than Marcus remembered, his once glossy coat now dull and patchy. The dog's ribs were visible through his fur, and his breathing seemed labored even in sleep. Kaveh, Marcus called softly through the kennel bars. The dog's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't lift his head. Marcus felt his heart sink, wondering if he had arrived too late. If the connection they had shared during those intense days after the earthquake had been severed by months of separation and illness. May I go inside with him? Marcus asked. Dr. Özkan unlocked the kennel door and Marcus stepped inside the small space. He sat cross-legged on the concrete floor beside Kaveh's blanket and gently placed his hand on the dog's side. The fur felt different, coarser and thinner than he remembered, but the warmth beneath was unmistakably alive. Hey, buddy, Marcus whispered. I'm here. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back, but I'm here now. For several minutes, nothing happened. Kaveh continued to breathe slowly, his eyes closed, showing no sign of recognition. Marcus began to wonder if his impulsive trip to Turkey had been a mistake, an emotional response to a situation that was beyond his ability to fix. Then, almost imperceptibly, Kaveh's tail moved. Just the slightest twitch against the blanket, but enough to make Marcus hold his breath with hope. The dog's dark eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually finding Marcus's face. What happened next was something that Dr. Özkan would later describe as the most remarkable thing he had witnessed in 20 years of veterinary medicine. Kaveh struggled to lift his head, his weakened muscles trembling with the effort, and pressed his nose against Marcus's palm. The dog's tail began to wag weakly, and a soft whimper escaped his throat, not a sound of pain, but of recognition and overwhelming relief. He knows you, Dr. Özkan said quietly from outside the kennel. In all the months he has been in Turkey, this is the first time I have seen him show interest in anything. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as Kaveh attempted to stand. The dog was incredibly weak, his legs shaking as he tried to move closer to the man who had pulled him from the earthquake rubble. Marcus gently supported Kaveh's weight as the dog pressed against his chest, his entire body trembling with emotion. I told you I'd come back, Marcus whispered into Kaveh's fur. I promised I wouldn't leave you behind, and I meant it. Over the next 3 days, Marcus spent every possible moment at the veterinary hospital. He had booked a small hotel room nearby, but he barely used it except to shower and change clothes. Most of his time was spent sitting beside Kaveh's kennel, talking to the dog, hand-feeding him small portions of food, and simply being present during the most critical phase of his recovery. The change in Kaveh's condition was remarkable. Dr. Özkan had warned Marcus not to expect miracles, but the dog's improvement seemed to defy medical logic. His appetite returned gradually, and he began drinking water without encouragement. More importantly, the spark had returned to his eyes, that intelligent, hopeful expression that Marcus remembered from their time together in the disaster zone. It's not just the medical treatment, Dr. Özkan explained as they watched Kaveh take his first tentative steps around the kennel. Dogs are emotional creatures, and this one had given up hope. Your presence has given him a reason to fight for his life again. Elif visited the hospital each day, bringing updates from her other rescued dogs and sharing her relief at seeing Kaveh's transformation. I knew he needed you, she said to Marcus, but I did not understand how much until I saw him today. He is becoming himself again. On Marcus's 4th day in Istanbul, Dr. Özkan delivered news that seemed almost too good to be true. Kaveh's kidney function has stabilized enough that I believe he can travel to America. But there are conditions. He will need immediate medical attention when he arrives, and his diet and medication schedule must be followed exactly. This is not a complete recovery. It is a managed illness that will require lifelong care. Marcus didn't hesitate. Whatever it takes. I've already been in contact with a veterinary specialist in Nashville who's agreed to take over his, treatment. The logistics of getting Cave ready for international transport became a whirlwind of activity. New health certificates had to be issued, the transport carrier had to be notified of the medical situation, and special arrangements had to be made for Cave's medications during the long flight. But the most challenging aspect wasn't logistical, it was emotional. After spending nearly a week together, the bond between Marcus and Cave had been rebuilt and strengthened. The dog had progressed from barely lifting his head to following Marcus around the veterinary facility, and the thought of another separation seemed almost cruel. He will be confused when you leave him at the airport, Dr. Ozkan warned. Dogs don't understand the concept of temporary separation for long-term reunion. All he will know is that you are leaving him again. Marcus had been dreading this moment since his arrival in Istanbul. The night before Cave's scheduled departure, he stayed at the hospital until well past visiting hours, lying on the floor of the kennel with the dog curled up against his side. Tomorrow you're going to go on a big adventure, Marcus explained to Cave, who was listening with the intense attention that dogs reserve for their most beloved humans. You're going to fly on an airplane to America, where Sarah and Emma are waiting to meet you. Emma is my little girl and she's been so excited about you coming home. She's made you a special bed and picked out toys for you to play with. Cave's tail wagged softly at the sound of Marcus's voice, even though the words were meaningless to him. What mattered was the tone. Gentle, reassuring, full of love and promise. I know you're going to be scared when I leave you at the airport tomorrow, but I need you to trust me one more time. I'll be waiting for you in New York when your plane lands. This isn't goodbye, it's just see you soon. The next morning at Ataturk Airport, the scene was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Cave had been sedated for the journey, but he was still alert enough to sense that something significant was happening. As Marcus handed the transport carrier to the airline officials, Cave pressed his face against the bars and whimpered softly. Be brave. Buddy, Marcus whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke Cave's nose one last time. I love you and I'll see you on the other side of the world in 18 hours. As Marcus watched the transport carrier disappear into the cargo area of the Turkish Airlines flight, he felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, unlike anything he had experienced during his military deployments. This time he wasn't just hoping to return home, safely himself. He was entrusting the life of his four-legged battle buddy to airline systems and international protocols completely beyond his control. His own flight to New York wouldn't depart for another 6 hours, which gave him time to worry about everything that could go wrong during Cave's journey. Weather delays, mechanical problems, temperature fluctuations in the cargo hold, complications from Cave's medical condition. The possibilities for disaster seemed endless. But as Marcus sat in the departure lounge, checking and rechecking his phone for updates from the airline, he reminded himself of something Dr. Ozkan had said the previous day. Some bonds are stronger than distance, stronger than time, stronger even than death. What you and this dog share is one of those bonds. Trust it. 18 hours later, Marcus would discover just how right the Turkish veterinarian had been about the power of that unbreakable connection forged in the ruins of a devastated city. The cargo area of John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York was a maze of conveyor belts, workers in reflective vests, and the constant roar of jet engines. Marcus paced nervously outside the Animal Import Center, checking his watch every few minutes and straining to hear any news about Turkish Airlines Flight 15, which had landed 20 minutes earlier. Sarah had flown up from Nashville with Emma, and the three of them waited together in the sterile facility that served as the entry point for all international animal arrivals. Emma clutched a new dog toy, a plush turkey she had insisted on buying because Cave is coming from Turkey, so he needs a turkey friend. Flight TK-15 animal cargo is now being processed, announced a uniformed official. Families waiting for pet arrivals. Please have your documentation ready for inspection. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he handed over the thick folder of veterinary records, import permits and health certificates that represented months of bureaucratic navigation. He had memorized every document, but the fear of some small oversight that could delay Kave's release made him second-guess everything. "Mr. Chen, your dog has arrived safely, but I need to inform you that he appears to be in some distress from the journey. Our veterinarian is examining him now to ensure he's fit for release." Marcus felt his stomach drop. After everything Kava had been through, the earthquake, the illness, the long separation, the idea that something had gone wrong during the flight seemed unbearably cruel. "Can we see him? Is he seriously injured? Let me check with the vet. Please wait here." The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Marcus found himself thinking about all the decisions that had led to this moment. The choice to enter that collapsed building in Turkey, the decision to save a dog instead of focusing solely on human victims, the months of fundraising and paperwork, the impulsive trip to Istanbul. Had he put Kava through additional trauma for his own emotional needs? "Mr. Chen, you can see your dog now. But please keep in mind that international transport is very stressful for animals. He may not seem like himself for several days." They were led through a series of doors into the quarantine area, where a young veterinarian in a white coat was kneeling beside a large transport crate. Through the bars, Marcus could see Kave huddled in the back corner, panting heavily and trembling. "He's physically fine," the vet explained. "All his vital signs are normal, and there are no signs of injury from the transport. But he's extremely anxious and hasn't responded to any of our attempts to coax him out of the carrier." Marcus approached the crate slowly, speaking in the same calm voice he had used during those first moments in the earthquake rubble. "Hey, Kava, it's okay, buddy. You made it. You're safe now." At the sound of Marcus's voice, Kava's ears perked up. The dog lifted his head, sniffing the air as if trying to confirm what his ears were telling him. Then, for the second time in a week, Marcus witnessed the miracle of recognition. Kava struggled to his feet inside the cramped carrier and pressed his nose against the bars, his tail beginning to wag with increasing enthusiasm. The transformation was instantaneous. From a traumatized, frightened animal to the alert, hopeful dog Marcus remembered. "Can we let him out?" Marcus asked. "The release area is just through here," the veterinarian said, leading them into a small room designed for pet reunions. The moment the carrier door opened, Kave bounded out and launched himself at Marcus with an energy that seemed impossible for a dog who had been critically ill just days earlier. He covered Marcus's face with kisses, his whole body wiggling with joy as he pressed against his rescued human. "Kave, meet your American family," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as Sarah and Emma knelt down to be introduced to the dog they had helped save from half a world away. Kave approached Sarah cautiously, sniffing her extended hand before allowing her to pet him. But when he saw Emma, something magical happened. The dog seemed to recognize her innocence and vulnerability, and he gently placed his head in her small lap, as if understanding that she was precious cargo that needed protecting. "He's so beautiful." "Daddy," Emma whispered, stroking Kava's fur with the reverence of a child who had waited months for this moment. "And he's really, really tired, isn't he?" The flight to Nashville was Kave's first experience as a passenger rather than cargo, and he spent the entire journey with his head in Marcus's lap, occasionally lifting it to look out the airplane window with curiosity. Other passengers smiled and whispered about the reunion they had witnessed at the gate, and the flight attendants made sure Kave had plenty of water for the journey. But the true test came when they arrived at their house in Kentucky. Marcus had worried that Kave might find the American suburban environment overwhelming after his life on the streets of Turkey and in rescue facilities. Instead, the dog seemed to understand immediately that this was home. He explored every room of the house methodically, sniffing corners and investigating furniture with the thoroughness of a security expert. When he discovered the dog bed that Emma had prepared for him in the living room, he circled it 3 times before settling down with a contented sigh. "I think he approves," Sarah said, watching Kave's eyes drift closed for the first time in over 30 hours. That night, Marcus lay awake listening to the soft sounds of Kave's breathing from the living room. The dog had refused to sleep anywhere except on the floor beside the couch where Marcus was trying to sleep, as if afraid that his human might disappear again if left unwatched. Around 3 a.m., Marcus heard Kave whimpering softly. When he investigated, he found the dog standing by the front door, pacing nervously and looking toward the street. "It's okay, boy. You're safe. We're not going anywhere." But Kave continued to pace, his anxiety building despite Marcus's reassurances. Finally, Marcus realized what was happening. After months of uncertainty and multiple separations, Kaveh needed constant proof that his family wasn't going to abandon him again. Marcus made a decision that Sarah would initially question, but eventually understand. He moved his pillow and blanket to the living room floor and settled down beside Kaveh's bed. The moment the dog felt Marcus's presence beside him, he relaxed completely and fell into the first peaceful sleep he had experienced since the earthquake. This might become a permanent arrangement, Marcus warned Sarah the next morning when she found them both sleeping on the living room floor. "I think that's exactly what this family needs," she replied, watching Kaveh follow Marcus to the kitchen with devoted attention. "All of us have been waiting for him to come home, even when we didn't realize it." As Marcus prepared Kaveh's first breakfast in America, he reflected on how much had changed since that moment in the Turkish rubble, when he first heard a frightened whimper calling for help. He had set out to rescue a dog, but somehow, Kaveh had ended up rescuing him. From the emotional numbness that had characterized his post-deployment life, from his inability to ask for help when he needed it, and from his fear of forming connections that might be lost. But even as Marcus celebrated Kaveh's successful arrival in America, he had no idea that their most difficult challenge was still ahead of them. The bond forged in disaster and strengthened through separation would soon be tested in ways that would determine whether their connection was strong enough to overcome the deepest kind of trauma, the kind that lives not in the body but in the soul. 6 months after Kaveh's arrival in Kentucky, the Chen family had settled into a routine that seemed almost too perfect to last. Kaveh's kidney condition had stabilized under Dr. Walsh's expert care, and the dog had gained back all the weight he had lost during his illness. His coat was glossy and thick again, and his energy levels had returned to those of a much younger dog. Emma had become Kaveh's devoted companion, and the dog had appointed himself as her official guardian. He walked her to the school bus stop each morning and was waiting at the front window when she returned each afternoon. During the summer months, they were inseparable, exploring the neighborhood together and playing elaborate games in the backyard that seemed to require no explanation between species. Sarah had documented their life together on the Bring Kaveh Home Facebook page, which now had thousands of followers who checked regularly for updates on the famous earthquake rescue dog. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring other military families to organize animal rescues and raising awareness about the emotional bonds that form between soldiers and animals in disaster zones. But beneath the surface of their apparent success, Marcus was struggling with demons that had nothing to do with Kaveh's physical recovery and everything to do with his own psychological wounds that had never properly healed. The nightmares had started about 3 months after Kaveh's arrival. Initially, Marcus attributed them to stress and the lingering anxiety from months of uncertainty about the dog's fate. But as they became more frequent and intense, he realized they were connected to something much deeper, unprocessed trauma from his years of military service that had been buried under layers of duty and professional competence. The dreams were always variations of the same theme. He was back in the earthquake rubble. But instead of finding Kaveh, he discovered human victims he was unable to save. Sometimes it was civilians from Turkey, sometimes fellow soldiers from his deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, and sometimes it was his own family members trapped beneath tons of concrete while he struggled helplessly to reach them. Marcus had become an expert at hiding his distress from Sarah and Emma, but Kaveh seemed to sense everything. On the nights when the nightmares were particularly severe, the dog would abandon his comfortable bed and lie across Marcus's chest, his weight serving as both comfort and anchor to reality. Kaveh's presence had become Marcus's most effective defense against the darkness that threatened to consume him during his most vulnerable hours. "You know, don't you, boy?" Marcus would whisper during those 3 a.m. moments when Kaveh's steady breathing was the only thing keeping him grounded. "You understand what it's like to survive something that changes you forever." Dr. Walsh had noticed the deep connection between Marcus and Kaveh during their veterinary visits, and she had gently suggested that Marcus might benefit from talking to someone about his own experiences. "Animals have an incredible ability to sense emotional trauma in humans," she explained. "Kaveh's behavior suggests that he's not just your companion. He's serving as your therapy animal, whether you realize it or not." Marcus had initially dismissed the suggestion. He had spent his entire military career believing that seeking help for psychological issues was a sign of weakness, a career-limiting admission that he couldn't handle the demands of his profession. But as the nightmares intensified and began affecting his performance at work, he realized that his stubborn self-reliance was becoming a liability. The breaking point came during a routine training exercise at Fort Campbell. Marcus was leading his squad through a simulated building collapse scenario when the sound of shifting debris triggered a massive panic attack. He found himself frozen in place, unable to breathe. His mind transported back to that day in Turkey, when he had crawled through the rubble searching for survivors. His commanding officer ordered him to report to the base medical facility for evaluation, and for the first time in his military career, Marcus was forced to confront the possibility that his psychological wounds might be as serious as any physical injury he had ever sustained. Staff Sergeant Chen, "What you're experiencing has a name," explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the base psychologist assigned to his case. Post-traumatic stress disorder isn't limited to combat situations. Disaster relief work, especially when it involves civilian casualties, can be just as traumatic as battlefield experiences. But I saved people in Turkey. I did my job successfully. Why would I develop PTSD from a successful mission? Because trauma isn't about failure or success. It's about exposure to situations that overwhelm your normal coping mechanisms. You witnessed massive human suffering, made life and death decisions under extreme pressure, and took responsibility for outcomes that were largely beyond your control. The fact that you performed well doesn't make you immune to psychological consequences. Dr. Martinez recommended a treatment program that would require several months of therapy sessions and possibly medication to manage his anxiety symptoms. She also suggested that Marcus consider applying for a service dog through the military's veteran support programs. "I already have a dog," Marcus said. "Kavi has been helping me more than any formal therapy program could." That's not uncommon. Many veterans find that animals they've rescued or bonded with during their service become unofficial therapy animals. But there's a difference between a pet that provides emotional support and a professionally trained service animal that can assist with specific PTSD symptoms. That evening, Marcus sat in his backyard with Kava, watching Emma play on her swing set while Sarah prepared dinner. The normalcy of the scene felt both precious and fragile, as if acknowledging his psychological struggles might somehow threaten the life they had built together. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, scratching behind Kava's ears. "Are you up for becoming an official therapy dog, or do you prefer being an amateur?" Kave responded by pressing his head against Marcus's leg and looking up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold infinite understanding and patience. Over the following months, Marcus began the difficult work of processing his trauma with Dr. Martinez, while simultaneously exploring options for having Kave certified as a psychiatric service animal. The process was more complex than he had anticipated, requiring extensive training for both dog and handler, but Kave demonstrated a natural aptitude for the work that surprised even experienced trainers. "He's already performing many of the behaviors we try to teach service dogs," explained Jennifer Torres, the trainer working with Marcus and Kave. "He grounds you during anxiety attacks, he interrupts nightmares by applying pressure, and he performs room searches to help you feel safe in new environments. We just need to formalize these behaviors and add a few more skills to his repertoire." The training sessions became a form of therapy for both Marcus and Kave. Working together toward a common goal strengthened their already deep bond while giving Marcus a sense of purpose that had been missing since his return from Turkey. For the first time since his military service began, he felt like he was building something positive rather than just responding to crises. Emma was fascinated by Kave's training and appointed herself as his unofficial assistant. She helped with basic commands and reward systems, and she created elaborate obstacle courses in their backyard to help Kave practice his mobility skills. "Daddy, Kave is going to be the best therapy dog in the whole world," she announced one afternoon. As they watched the dog navigate through a series of challenges Torres had designed to test his problem-solving abilities. "Why do you think that, sweetheart?" Marcus asked. "Because he already saved you once in Turkey, and now he gets to save you every single day for the rest of his life. That's what families do. They save each other." As Marcus watched his daughter play with the dog he had pulled from earthquake rubble 18 months earlier, he realized she was right. They had all saved each other in ways that had nothing to do with dramatic rescues or heroic gestures. Sarah had saved him from isolation by supporting his impractical mission to bring Kava home. Emma had saved both him and Kaveh by believing unquestioningly in the power of love to overcome impossible obstacles. And Kaveh had saved Marcus from the darkness that threatened to consume him by offering unconditional loyalty and the kind of healing that could only come from a creature who had survived his own trauma and emerged stronger. 6 months later, Kaveh received his official certification as a psychiatric service animal, and Marcus was cleared to return to full duty with his four-legged partner at his side. But more importantly, he had learned that true strength wasn't about enduring suffering alone. It was about accepting help when it was offered and building connections that could withstand any catastrophe. The earthquake that brought them together had lasted less than 2 minutes, but the bond it created had already survived separation, illness, bureaucracy, and trauma. As Marcus looked toward the future, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Kava would face them together, two survivors who had found in each other the courage to heal and the strength to keep moving forward, one day at a time.